Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, the Locked On Lakers guys, the Kamenetzky brothers, are joining to talk all about Troy Brown Jr. I want to break down, first of all, what I think his role will be with the Wolves. We'll get their scouting report on him, what he did in LA, what he was good at, what his shortcomings were, etc. And it's all about Troy Brown Jr. today, one of the newest members of the Wolves. It's all coming to the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. And a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, Locked On Wolves is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at BBeacon. That's with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right, so today, it's all about Troy Brown Jr., one of the newest members of the Wolves. I want to talk a little bit of a refresher on who he is as a player. And then I have the Kamenetsky brothers, Andy, Brian Kamenetsky from Locked On Lakers, on the show to give their scouting report on what he did for the Lakers last year. He was a starter for really the first chunk of the season. Obviously, the Lakers were very disappointing until the very end of the season, but he maintained a rotation role all the way until the playoffs. So I'll ask them about that, like what his role was, why his minutes kind of peaked and then kind of slowly waned as the season wore on and as the team got further into the playoffs. And then also, like, is he a 3-and-D guy? Is he an energy guy? Does he operate any offense? What does he do in the half court, et cetera? So we'll get to all that with Troy Brown Jr. If you're less familiar with him as a player, if you missed the show I did right after the Wolves signed him, basically, Troy Brown Jr. is, in a lot of respects, he's going to fill part of the Taurean Prince role, at least in terms of the defense. And the Kamenetsky brothers talk about this a little bit, about his defensive aptitude. And I went on Locked On Lakers and talked a bit about Taurean Prince, and I tried to I don't know, maybe quell their excitement is maybe a little strong because I like Taurean Prince a lot, but I wanted them to understand, like, hey, he's not like a top flight perimeter defender. I think Troy Brown Jr. is a better one-on-one perimeter defender than Taurean Prince, and I don't think it's particularly close. Watching the eye test last year of Taurean Prince, he got into some tough spots because the Wolves, I think, overextended him, gave him some roles, essentially like, hey, Jaden McDaniels is in foul trouble, TP, go guard somebody. Like, at times, he just looked a step slow. He wasn't a good rebounder. Like, there's some shortcomings he had. Troy Brown Jr. is a better perimeter defender, and he is a better rebounder than Taurean Prince, despite being really more of a 3 than a 4. Taurean Prince at this point in his career mostly plays the 4. But Troy Brown Jr. is a better all-around rebounder and a better all-around defender than Taurean Prince. Go over to ESPN's Real Plus Minus. And Taurean Prince, I didn't actually get the chance to tell them this. It was more I didn't have the heart to tell those guys this stat. But Taurean Prince last year was dead last in ESPN's defensive Real Plus Minus statistic at the power forward position, a minus 6.27. For some context, he was almost 2 full points, like 1.8 points worse than the next worst player. He was like 96th, and the 95th player was almost 2 full points better than Taurean Prince. Now, that's one metric, but many of the other catch-alls don't like what he did defensively either. And it all backs up what we all watched with our eyes last year. I think Taurean Prince's perimeter individual point of attack, on an island isolation defense, however you want to phrase it, was a bit rough around the edges last year. He's still a very good team defender. Troy Brown Jr., I can't speak a whole lot, and I didn't watch him a lot last year. And I actually asked this question or a similar question to the Locked On Lakers guys. I can't speak to his team defense, but I know Taurean Prince is a good team defender. I also know Troy Brown Jr. is much better as an individual defender at the point of attack. And those guys also talk a bit about how he is really, he guards the ball handle. He's a point of attack defender. That was his role off the bench for the Lakers. And the Wolves, yes, they have Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Shake Milton's not a great defender. And that's kind of it. I mean, otherwise you're talking Kyle Anderson, Naz Reid. You're talking about guys that aren't going to be guarded in the perimeter, Jordan McLaughlin. So Troy Brown Jr. is likely going to be guarding opposing point guards off the bench. and the Wolves will probably try and hide Shake Milton somewhere, and then use Nickeil Alexander-Walker to guard the most dangerous wing on the other team. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the show. I'll kind of talk about what I think the actual role for Troy Brown Jr. is. So we'll do all that here after we play the Locked On Lakers convo. So without further ado, let's get to my conversation with the Locked On Lakers guys. So here's that. And again, after I talk to them, I'll give a bit more of my thoughts related to a potential role for Troy Brown Jr. this year. All right, here's my conversation with Brian and Andy Kamenetsky over at Locked On Lakers. All right, as promised, the Kamenetzky brothers from Locked On Lakers to talk a little bit of Troy Brown Jr. And get a bit of a scouting report on one of the Wolves, I guess technically two new free agent additions to the roster. And we talked a little bit of Taurean Prince on Locked On Lakers. And part of what Troy Brown Jr. will be doing is at least in part replacing the Taurean Prince role in Minnesota. Different players, certainly. So let's learn a little bit more about what he brought in LA. And first of all, thanks for joining me, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us.
So Troy Brown Jr., what was his role in the rotation for the Lakers? I know he was primarily rotation guy for most of the season, might have lost his role a little bit towards the end of the year, but what was kind of like, was he just kind of an energy type guy off the bench, or what was the expectation for Troy Brown?
I think the highest end expectation, and at times it was met, was to be a legitimate 3-and-D guy for the team, like somebody that could help take some of the defensive pressure off LeBron, in certain respects off Anthony Davis, like really off the entire defense, take some of those difficult assignments, provide spacing. At times during the season, I thought he did the role really well. There were other times where he wasn't as effective. I think a lot of his effectiveness comes from when he would come into the game and the amount of minutes that he had. Generally speaking, I think he was much more effective as a starter, playing more minutes than somebody coming off the bench playing 12 to 15. Like he's one of those guys that the returns start to diminish, I think, the less he plays, as opposed to more, just because, he is a solid outside shooter. He was 38% for the season for the Lakers, but he's not so good that he's somebody you can just put into a game cold, expect him to take 3 threes and hit 2, or somebody that can just come in cold and make a lot happen. He's somebody that I think really needs to feel the game and kind of ease his way into it. And playing alongside LeBron, playing alongside AD, some of the better players, you're going to get more looks. And I think it helps just define his role, put it into a more specific lane better.
It's funny. I feel like with your description, I feel like we were talking about Malik Beasley there for a minute, another former Timberwolves, former Laker. Cause that's pretty much exactly what I'd say about obviously different players, but Malik was very he much better as a starter in Minnesota than he was off the bench. And I feel like he was somebody better, certainly a better shooter than Troy Brown, but needed to get those minutes next to good players in order to be effective. And speaking of his shooting, 38% last year is at least 3 points higher than any other season of his career. Was any rhyme or reason to that? Was he just getting more catch it? Not that you guys watched a ton of him and watched him to Chicago, but
I think that's the $1 million question.
Yeah.
I mean, almost literally the $1 million question that they'll be answering in Minnesota is it was that real? Because Brown at 36, 37, 38, 39% is a useful guy. He's particularly on a minimum, basically, which is that's correct. Like it's basically what you guys signed him on.
Yeah, it's like $4 million. So pretty much.
That guy has. Oh, I didn't realize he got a little more than that. So still a reasonable amount of money if he's in that high 30s range. Very useful player because, like Andy said, he does a lot of things well. He's not great at any one thing, but he's very good at staying in his role, very good at staying in his lane. He's not going to get in the way of a lot of stuff. He's not going to overshoot, can get buckets for you when you need it. He's not afraid to take shots either, which I think is important, particularly when you're playing around other good offensive players. But I have no idea if 38% is an outlier or if that's where he's going. He's young enough that it could be a real thing, and he trending 35% the year before in Chicago, and there is a possibility at least that is real. And if it is, then the money that he gets and the role that he can play with the Wolves is pretty reasonable because he offers a lot of just decent qualities as a player. And, I think you got, being pretty good at a lot of things has good value around the league, even if you're not great at any of them.
Today's episode is brought to us by our friends at FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 that you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run. It's all in an app that's safe, secured, super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. Betting baseball is a ton of fun, and we're only a few weeks off from betting NFL. College football starts up. I think we're like exactly a month away from real college football, like 3 weeks away from preseason NFL and 5-6 weeks away from real NFL football. College sports in general, WNBA, FIBA World Cup basketball, it's all going to be over there at FanDuel. There's no better place to bet on any of these sports than FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Yeah, and the Wolves need to replace Taurean Prince's, really, they have to replace the 38, 39, 40% shooting that Taurean Prince brought to the table. And they're trying to do that with a combination of Troy Brown Jr. and Shake Milton. Then both of those actually go in opposite directions, right? Shake Milton was a better shooter a few years ago, dipped a little bit the last couple of years, or at least last year. And Troy Brown spiked a little last year. So if you can kind of paper over that with both of them, and then you add back Nickeil Alexander-Walker to help with some of the defensive duties that Prince took on last year. And I think Alexander-Walker's a better defender than Taurean Prince is. That's kind of the theory, is you're taking Prince and I guess Jalen Noel and Alexander Walker at the end of the year, and you're replacing them with Troy Brown Jr., Shake Milton, and Nickeil Alexander-Walker, re-signing him. So I mean, that's kind of the idea. And that's, I actually said as much when they signed him, was like, hey, I don't know if this 38% is real. If it's not, it seems like he's a much less valuable player if he just does a little bit of everything. On the defensive end of the floor, you mentioned that he was kind of thought of as like a 3-and-D type guy, or at least that was the idea in the first place. What was he being asked to do defensively? Like, was he being asked to off the bench guard, like, the sixth man of the other team, or was he primarily just kind of, they were trying to have him guard point of attack, point of attack on the opposite end, or what was he being asked to do defensively?
He was much more on ball as a primary role. I thought like he was somebody that the Lakers looked to at least try to put on one of the team's better scorers, assuming size-wise it would work out. Like, Troy is somebody that I thought was more effective guarding smalls than trying to guard up a position. Like, if I had to put him on either a really quick point guard or a four that isn't as fast but definitely strong, I would take my chances on the point guard. Like, I think he was much more effective when he can try to create some type of size or length advantage over the person he's defending, as opposed to trying to use quickness or deceptive strength against a bigger guy.
Okay.
There could be times where I thought he was pretty effective as that primary defender. There were other times where he looked, ordinary. The effort is always there. I think the instincts are always there. He is solid in the role. It's funny when you were talking before about the replacing of Taurean Prince. In a lot of ways, Brian and I have talked about, we consider Taurean Prince a replacement to both Troy Brown and Malik Beasley. So it's just one big circular thing going on right now between the Wolves and
frankly,
Lakers.
I would call him an upgrade over both. I mean, if you're asking me who's a better player, it's Taurean Prince. And unless Brown, who is still, I'm just looking it up, about to turn 24. There is still room for growth there, and he has not been in situations that really provide a ton of stability. I think it would have been interesting to see like what could happen if he got to spend 3 or 4 years with the Lakers, with LeBron, with Anthony Davis, with stability around the same coach. Obviously that's not going to happen. And I don't know if like the long-term future is there in Minnesota either.
Right.
But the potential is still there for him to get better. He's got room.
Yeah. And it's interesting. The Wolves, I mean, like in my mind, he's the 10th guy in the rotation right now. So I don't know that he's going to get, I mean, you guys talked about the more minutes, the better he's that type of a player. And I don't know that those minutes, he's probably behind Alexander Walker in the small forward pecking order, if you will. And Kyle Anderson's going to have to play the 3 a lot more than he did last year because Naz Reid is making a lot of money. So like, there's it'll be interesting to me to see how Chris Finch kind of handles this rotation, because really, like I would say, I mean, McDaniels is your starting three. Kyle Anderson is going to play a lot of minutes at the three, and then you still have Alexander Walker. I think Shake Milton is going to effectively be the backup point guard, which I guess means that between Brown and Alexander Walker, there's your wings. But he's going to have to fight for minutes, and it's encouraging that there's some upside there. I just think it's a really interesting. The Wolves have kind of acquired all these guys. You know, they have a bunch of big guys and they have a bunch of guys that are like 6'6", except for Mike Conley, that they're just going to kind of try and figure it out. What was kind of the reasoning? I know he started a bunch towards the beginning of the season, and then just kind of looking at his game log, it seems like he pretty consistently, Troy Brown Jr. was still getting like mid-20s, upper 20s minutes wise, even late in the year after the deadline. And then in the playoffs, those minutes just kind of tapered off. Was that more just a function of it was the playoffs, and so the rotation tightened and they needed offense, so it was Malik Beasley getting those minutes? Or, well, I guess Beasley was kind of out of the rotation at the end too, but what was that just really, it was the playoffs, and so we didn't have enough minutes for you?
Yeah, I think post trade deadline, once they got D'Lo, once they got Hachimura, and they added Vanderbilt, and the balance of the roster was much better. They didn't have to play guys kind of out of position, and wings were against players that they probably should have, and they had a little more balance. Once that happened, it did eat into his role, because you had more viable offensive options. You had a guy in Vanderbilt who could play, fill some of that defensive role that maybe you were leaning on Brown to do before. And so, and then in the playoffs, obviously things shorten up. Austin Reeves starts to play, 30 something minutes a game, things like that.
And Troy was not hitting shots at all. That was a real problem.
It just sort of whittles away at the available minutes for Brown.
Gotcha. Yeah. And like I said, I mean, like I would imagine that the goal here, and you talked about Prince being the better player. I think in a vacuum, that's certainly true. The Prince role, I think I said this on your guys when we talked about Taurean Prince. The Prince role is effectively now being divided up between some of those guys I just mentioned in the Wolves rotation, and they're going to kind of go at it with quantity more so than quality. And hopefully somebody pops out and is kind of the guy as the backup wing, off the bench. Last question: which player is more likely? I don't know. It's July, right? But which player is more likely to hurt the other team with the play-in or playoff series heroic performance? Taurean Prince scored 35 or 38 in the Garden this year. So I guess it could be Taurean Prince, but I mean, come April,
you got me looking up Troy Brown game logs and stuff.
Yeah,
I think the answer is Taurean Prince, just because I think the odds are better that he's going to have a more defined role with the Lakers than Brown would have with the Wolves. Last couple things just with Troy, just for fans to watch for. He's a very good cutter. Like, he's somebody that can be good and active off the ball. He is also a better passer than I expected. Like, he's not a playmaker. He's not somebody that you would have run sets or anything like that, but he's very good at moving the ball to the right place. And, Brian mentioned before, kind of keeping the wheels greased and moving. He is better at that than I expected.
Yeah, he doesn't do dumb things. At least not frequently. And that's nice, especially when you talk about a guy closer to the end of the rotation. Like, those are the people you want to come in and not sort of like first do no harm.
Yep.
I think he qualifies as that. And if he's hitting shots, over the course of the season, closer to 40% than 30, there's some good that can come out of that too.
Well, and I mentioned replacing Taurean Prince's minutes. The other player whose minutes they're replacing is Jalen Noel, and he was the guy who would come in and do the dumb things. So now, like, the Wolves are just trying to, exactly what you said, like, guys that can come in off the bench and play a role, and you play him next, can play with the second unit and kind of run things, and then Troy Brown can be a 3-and-D guy and provide some energy. I mean, I think that's definitely what the Wolves are hoping for. All right. Appreciate you guys coming on. And of course, go check out Locked On Lakers for all things Lakers. We know that the Wolves and Lakers are likely to both kind of be hopefully in the mix next year, hopefully a little better, at least better in the regular season. Hopefully not. They're both the Lakers finished great, but either team would like to be in the play-in next year, at least speaking for Wolves fans. I'm sure you guys feel the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. Lakers are looking to build on what they did last year and get into the Western Conference Finals. All
right. Check out Locked On Lakers for all things Lakers. Appreciate you guys coming on.
Anytime.
All right. So there you have it. My conversation with Brian and Andy Kamenetsky over at Locked On Lakers. And my take on everything that those guys said about Troy Brown Jr. is I was heartened, I guess, to hear what they said at the end about him being a good cutter in the half court. I neglected to ask some of those kind of more in-depth offensive questions because in my mind, he's not going to be asked to do a whole lot in the half court. I think it's the Wolves second unit in my mind at this point is going to be a lot of Anthony Edwards creating with those guys in the second unit. You may get some Shake Milton creating, and then everybody else is going to be asked to just get out in transition and space the floor. Troy Brown Jr. was 39% catch and shoot last year. I mean, Taurean Prince was 41%. For the season, Prince was a little better overall from three. If Troy, as those guys talked about, if Troy Brown Jr.'s 38+% last season is for real, and one of them mentioned in Chicago the year before, he was up from like 32 to 35%. Like if there's really a trend in the right direction and he's only 24 years old, still improving as a shooter, then this contract's going to look like a bargain because if he could catch and shoot at 40+% and play the Taurean Prince role and also get out in transition and use his athleticism and frankly youth that Taurean Prince doesn't have, and still be a better point of attack defender and a better all-around team defender and actually still a better rebounder. By the way, I talked extensively about Taurean Prince's rebounding issues over at Locked On Lakers. So if you want to hear me talk about that again, check out their episode. But they also pointed out like Troy Brown Jr. for his size and role was a decent rebounder, better than Taurean Prince. So I think both teams here are very happy with the player that they ended up with. Those guys are very happy about having Taurean Prince. Trust me, they're excited about it. They say he's the better all-around player. I think in a vacuum, that's probably true. And I know that now Troy Brown Jr.'s salary is higher, but Prince also signed a $9 million+ deal just last summer, just a year ago. I think in a vacuum, you would still say Taurean Prince is the better player. But what the Wolves are trying to do with their bench, having Troy Brown and Shake Milton is better for the Wolves than if they had only had Taurean Prince and then we're stuck with only Jordan McLaughlin as the backup point guard. But as it is, Jordan McLaughlin's their safety net, right? He's like their 12th guy. He's their third point guard. They have Shake Milton and they have Troy Brown Jr. And again, better perimeter defender, a better rebounder, younger, more athletic, ultimately cheaper, like half the price as Taurean Prince, and only a little bit worse as a shooter. And Taurean Prince is a really, really good shooter. Troy Brown Jr. was very good last year. Now, if he goes back to what he did early in his career in Washington and Chicago, it's a bit of a different story. But if we're still talking that neighborhood of 38% catch and shoot around 40%, between that and Shake Milton, you're backfilling much of the Taurean Prince shooting that you lost. And Nickeil Alexander-Walker, anything you get from him is gravy. But that's kind of the idea here, right? Is you take the combination of Shake Milton, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and Troy Brown Jr. have to replace Taurean Prince and Jalen Noel, and I guess to a lesser extent what you had from Jordan McLaughlin last year. And I think the Wolves have the better set of players now. Now, back to what Troy Brown did with the Lakers, as those guys said towards the end of our conversation, the reason that he lost his role was more just like, hey, the emergence of Austin Reeves, you're going to be giving more, the ball is going to be in the hands of D'Angelo Russell more often, and playoff shortened rotation, et cetera. But as I said at the beginning of the conversation, the one thing that concerns me a little is if Troy Brown's really one of those guys who needs those minutes to feel confident and isn't like a come in cold off the, to use a baseball term, there's some guys that can't be a pinch hitter because they can't come in cold and get a hit after sitting there all day. Can Troy Brown Jr. come in cold off the bench and knock down a three and wreak havoc on the defensive end of the floor? Those guys seem to be a bit apprehensive about those prospects, and they thought he was much better as a starter and much better when he played heavier minutes early in the season. And as I said, that's how I feel about Malik Beasley. Like, we'll see how this plays out, but that is something to keep in mind, especially because he's probably going to be the 10th guy, right? The Wolves rotation, like, we already know what the starting lineup is. We know it's Mike Conley at the point. We know it's Anthony Edwards in the backcourt with him. We know it's Jaden McDaniels, Karl-Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert. We know that the first two guys off the bench in some order are Naz Reid and Kyle Anderson. Those are your backups at the 3 and 4, and between Naz, Cat, and Rudy, that's your 5. Now you just got to figure out the 1 and the 2 and your other 3s. That's Shake Milton backing up at point guard, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and Troy Brown Jr. Troy Brown Jr. is clearly, to me, the 10th guy on that list. He's not as good of a defender as Alexander-Walker. He's not as probably, I know he shot the ball better than Milton last year, but do you trust him to shoot the ball as well as Milton going forward? He's not as good of an all-around offensive player, we'll say, as Shake Milton. He's not going to be running offense like Shake Milton. So he's clearly the 10th man. In some ways, a little bit like what Austin Rivers was doing at the start of last year, like a fringe rotation guy, depending on the night he's in the rotation or he's out of the rotation. He's not a true replacement for Taurean Prince because he's more of a 3 than he is a 4. And he's not a true replacement for Jalen Noel. That's really more Shake Milton's role. So what does his role end up being? I think it really is the 10th man. If Jaden McDaniels or Nickeil Alexander-Walker or Kyle Anderson's in foul trouble, you're going to see more of Troy Brown Jr. If not, he might be a 10, 12 minute a game guy. Like he may be playing some of those Austin Riversy type minutes from the beginning of the season and not really much more than that. Now, if it's a bigger front line of an opposing team, we may see more Josh Minott than we see Troy Brown Jr. I think that the way the contract is structured also with the second year being, essentially it's not technically a team option. It's not guaranteed, right? The Wolves are kind of like, is he even going to be a rotation guy, right? I think he is number 10 on the depth chart right now. Could go either way. And as the guys at Locked On Lakers said, like he's only 24. There's some upside. Like if he all of a sudden plays really well in a Wolves uniform and shows the ability to do different things, then who knows? I mean, there's the possibility he could turn into somebody that plays more minutes. He could always overtake a Nickeil Alexander-Walker on the depth chart. It's unlikely he ends up overtaking a Shake Milton, but we also know that there's injuries over the course of the season. Like Taurean Prince didn't start very often for the Wolves last year, but he started 4 or 5 games. And we saw at the end of the year, all of a sudden Alexander-Walker was playing heavy minutes because of the Jaden McDaniels injury. So hard to say exactly what happens there, right? But at any rate, that's all we have for you today on the show. We're going to talk more roster construction and like just the roster as a whole and roles for each individual player. And then also just kind of a smattering of news. That'll be all next week. There's plenty to get to still this offseason. By the way, we are still daily throughout next week. So make sure you're following and subscribed, that you tune in each and every day. A big thank you to those that do make us your first listen every day. It's greatly appreciated. This show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. More great local sports coverage 24/7, and it's free. Download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. A reminder, we will be back next week again. All 5 days, plenty to get to, lots of offseason ahead to discuss. We're also not too far off from FIBA World Cup basketball, around a month or so away from that. So plenty to get to. Make sure that you're with us every day as we move forward here throughout August. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.